From the earliest times, man has believed that fire has the sacred power to destroy evil. A great many fire-worshipping festivals are still observed around Japan. The water-drawing festival at Todaiji Temple in Nara is one of them. An enormous torch is carried at great speed around the balcony. It's said that the sparks will protect you from illness and misfortune. The water drawing festival lasts for 2 weeks, but it starts with this interesting ceremony. The festival itself is a Buddhist occasion, but first, the monks go to pray at a Shinto shrine nearby. We've come to the climax of the long celebrations, the ceremony of drawing the sacred water, which is to be offered to the 11-headed Bodhisattva of mercy, the principal image of this temple. This is how the whole festival got its name. A Buddhist celebration where the Buddha and native gods are in complete harmony. This phenomenon has long fascinated Shuichi Kato. The public are not allowed to watch the water drawing ceremony. The interesting thing here is that the sacred water is said to be a gift from the Shinto deity of the Onyu shrine. Here too, a Shinto god plays an important role in Buddhist rites.
The Nigatsudo Hall, typical of several Buddhist temples in the compounds of Todaiji temples in Nara, and yet we find a Shinto shrine standing right in front of it. I'm sure you wouldn't find anything like this in other parts of the world. Only in Japan is this sort of thing acceptable, two religions, Shintoism and Buddhism, complementing one another. There's nothing unusual about seeing a Shinto shrine in the precincts of Buddhist temples in Japan. Now, it would be unthinkable to have, say, an Islamic mosque standing right on the doorsteps of a Christian church, so it must be the Japanese phenomenon which is unusual. Only in Japan would you see something like this. In fact, you couldn't get more typically Japanese than this.
The people of ancient Japan believed in the presence of the gods in every aspect of the natural world. The gods wielded enormous power, so they were greatly feared. They could reward the people with the good things of life, but they could also bring down disaster on their heads. The Kamanomiya Suwa shrine on the Noto Peninsula. People have hammered sickle blades into the trunk of the tree in the hope that the god will be appeased and will keep the winds calm. Rocks and trees were treated with respect because they were said to be the dwelling place of the invisible gods. The people of Irabu Island in Okinawa welcome the gods to their island during the Yukui festival. The Shinto gods of Japan are the spirits of our ancestors, and they are also the patron gods of tribes and villages. The god of this village lives far beyond the seas, but he visits his people from time to time. The islanders welcome the god and receive his blessing for the harvest. And then it's time to see him off again. The Onbashira, or Sacred Post Festival, at the Suwa Shrine in Nagano Prefecture in central Japan. The people believe that this enormous fir tree is the sacred dwelling place of a god. They have chopped down the sacred tree and brought it all the way down from the mountain to the shrine, a distance of 2 kilometers. Despite the risk of injury, the men are all eager for a chance to jump onto the speeding tree and share in the god's power. In ancient times, the Japanese believed that 8 million gods dwelt in the sea, the mountains and the rivers, and in every nook and cranny, down to the most humble weed. But these were local gods. Their powers were limited to their own territory or their own tribe. However, a completely different transcendental teaching found its way into the world of the 8 million gods. The introduction of Buddhism. Buddhism first entered Japan in the middle of the 6th century, when statues of the Buddha, the Sutra, and other artifacts were sent over from the court of King Sung-ming of Korea. The surprise and bewilderment of the Japanese when they first saw a statue of the Buddha is well expressed in the words of the Emperor Kinmei. The face of the Holy Buddha, how it shines. Never before have I seen anything like this. The question is, do I revere it or not? Should the Emperor allow Buddhism to enter Japan? He couldn't make up his mind, so he left the decision to the ruling clans. The powerful clans were of two minds. Some welcomed the idea of bringing Buddhism into Japan, while others feared the wrath of the 8 million Shinto gods. An interesting point is that the ruling clans called the Buddha the god of our neighboring country, and then went on to treat the Buddha just like one of the native gods. So, as with their own gods, they hoped that Buddhism would cure their illnesses, bring rain, and give them victory in combat. Their expectations were first and foremost for the rewards of this life. Splendid Buddhist temples of the like they had never seen before. Brilliantly shining statues of the Buddha. solemn recitations of the sutra, and many other rituals. People must have looked with wonder and amazement at this new religion. Little by little, Buddhism worked its way into the hearts and minds of the people. In 639 AD, about 100 years after the arrival of Buddhism in Japan, the Emperor Jomei built the Hasedera Temple. This was the first time that an emperor had been responsible for the construction of a Buddhist temple. From then on, temples began to spring up all over the country. During the Asuka age, from the mid-6th to the mid-7th century, there were about 50 temples in Nara and the area south of Osaka. But in the 50 years or so that followed, the number of temples increased tenfold to over 500. This moonlight bodhisattva dates back to the end of the 7th century, when Buddhism spread rapidly throughout Japan. At this time, Japan was being transformed into a nation ruled by the emperor, acting in accordance with the body of new law. Kato feels that this acceptance of Buddhism was connected with the propagation of Chinese culture, coming at a time when Japan was being unified.
We talk about the acceptance of Buddhism, but that isn't the whole picture. We should always think of it in the full context of the large-scale import of Chinese culture at that time. It was a question of the overall acceptance of Chinese culture, its social organization, government structure, sophisticated technology, and the mystically alluring rituals and works of art that went with all this. It was a question of accepting the whole package or nothing at all. Let's take a look, for instance, at the written word. For the Japanese of those times, when they were presented with the Chinese written script, the difference between having or not having a written language must have been rather like the situation in our times with the introduction of the computer. An oral language meant that if you wanted to find out something about the past, you had to go looking for someone with an extraordinary memory. But a written language meant that you didn't have to rely solely on people's memories. With a written language, specialists in each field could sort out all the information they had about the past and write it all down. So you always had something concrete to refer to. You no longer had to rely on the memory of an individual. It was so much quicker and more convenient, so much more reliable, and you could keep on adding to the data all the time. It's very similar to the present age of the computer and what went before. So, with the case of the Chinese written language, perhaps there was a choice. But if they'd refused to accept Chinese writing, they would have been left in a very primitive state. By welcoming the written language, they at last had the chance of catching up with the more advanced cultures of the mainland.
In 743 AD, Emperor Shomu began a big project which was to leave an indelible mark on Buddhism in Japan. The so-called Great Buddha, cast in copper, is 16 meters high. This magnificent Buddha stands out as one of the finest in the world. It was a work of national pride and effort, the crowning glory of Buddhism's 200-year history in Japan. The emperor declared in an edict that the doctrines of Buddhism were to be taught throughout the land, and that Buddhism was to be the great protector of the state. And every single person in the country was to contribute in some way to the building of the great Buddha. In this way, the nation would come together as one in spirit. An epoch-making event took place at this time. The Usa Hachiman God of Oita in southern Japan offered his services for the building of the great Buddha. This was his message: I and the other gods of the earth and the heavens will come to your aid. We shall make copper flow like water and guarantee the successful casting of the Buddha. At that time, northern Kyushu was an important source of copper, and the Usa Hachiman Shrine thrived because the god there kept a fatherly watch over the mining and refining of the copper, which was to be used for the great Buddha. Thus, the Shinto gods gave enthusiastic support for the construction of the Buddha, the foremost symbol of Buddhism. What meaning did it have for both religions? From the Buddhist point of view, the help of the gods was a truly welcome event, because it meant that Shintoism had accepted Buddhism. It also proved beneficial for the Shinto gods. By contributing to the construction of the Buddha, they had shown how powerful they were, and it was a good opportunity to ensure that both religions could coexist. The state also profited by this event. Buddhism and Shintoism had managed to cooperate peacefully, and as a result, the whole nation was working as one towards a common goal. The great Buddha was completed 9 years after Emperor Shomu declared his edict, and the Hachiman god was invited to be the protector of Todaiji Temple. Before long, the Hachiman god became one of the most powerful, with shrines in every part of the country. From this time onwards, Shintoism and Buddhism managed to thrive side by side. The water-drawing festival of Todaiji. It's thought that this festival was instituted the very year that the statue of the great Buddha was completed. The close relationship between Shintoism and Buddhism has left its unmistakable mark on this festival as well. Every night during the water-drawing festival, the names of over 13,000 Shinto gods are recited, inviting them to participate in the ritual. In this mountain village in West Germany, they still observe an old festival known as Fastnacht. It goes back to the days before Christianity, when the festivities were dedicated to the old Germanic gods. They celebrate this festival to drive out winter and to welcome in spring. The procession goes through the streets with people wearing masks and noisy bells. These masks represent the ancient Germanic gods and spirits. At the original Fastnacht, the people welcomed the gods and prayed for a plentiful harvest. But with the coming of Christianity, belief in all but the one true God was forbidden. Despite countless attempts by the church to ban this festival, Fastnacht has survived, although the Germanic gods have relinquished their power, and the festival has taken on a different meaning. The clown is being whipped and chased away. This seems to symbolize the sad fate of the old gods. The Bamiyan region of Afghanistan used to be an important link between India and Central Asia. Two enormous statues of the Buddha still stand here. In the 7th century, this was the sacred dwelling place of several thousand Buddhist monks who lived and prayed by this golden Buddha. They suffered damage when the area was taken over by the Muslims, who forbade the worship of images. In many parts of the world, the peaceful coexistence of different religions seems to be difficult. When Buddhism first reached the shores of Japan, the Shinto religion had no coherent creed to match that of Buddhism. In fact, the native gods seem to have learned quite a lot from the teachings of Buddha. Following the example of Buddhism, the Shinto religion built magnificent shrines for their gods, who then presided deep in the sanctuary. In this way, the people could always go and pay homage to their gods. An image of the Hachiman God dressed as a monk, flanked by the Empress Jingu and Princess Nakatsu. Once again, following the example of Buddhism, the Shinto gods took on material form as statues. In 890 AD, a Hachiman Shrine was erected in the precincts of the Shuichi Temple in Nara, so that the Hachiman God could keep guard over the Buddhist temple. This statue of the Hachiman God in monk's robes was carved at that time. Originally, the Shinto gods only dwelt in the rocks and the trees, and they never actually showed themselves. But then they became Buddhas and took on solid form. The Hachiman God transformed into a monk. This seems to symbolize the power of Buddhism and how it took positive steps to embrace Shintoism. But not all gods took on the guise of a monk. This is a deity of the Matsuo Taisha shrine in Kyoto, a powerful representation of the violent strength of some of the native gods. The sharp strokes of the chisel can be felt even through the paint. This statue has been carved from a single piece of Japanese cypress. Perhaps it is a rendering of the belief that a god dwells in this tree. Many of the statues of Shinto gods are carved from wood. The styles and techniques of Buddhist carvings were eagerly adopted for Shinto images. But the Shinto gods maintained their individuality by their facial expression, the clothes they wore, and by the weapons and ornaments they carried. The Sanchi area of central India. Stupas standing on the hilltop house the relics of the Sakyamuni, the Sanskrit word for the Buddha. Carvings at the entrance of the stupa depict stories about the Buddha in great detail. But the actual figure of the Buddha is nowhere to be seen, and he is symbolized by the halo and the sacred bow tree. In the 1st century BC, the Buddha was too awesome a presence to depict in human form. After this time, Buddhism, without a concrete image of the Buddha, spread to the far corners of the known world, coming into contact with many races and cultures. In the course of these encounters, the formal image of the Buddha was born. One of the first regions to welcome Buddhism was Gandhara in Pakistan. In the 1st century AD, this area was inhabited by tribes who had been influenced by Greco-Roman culture. The earliest statues of the Buddha came from this area, modeled in the Greco-Roman style. This is one of the oldest statues of the Buddha, from the Jetavana monastery. Except for the halo, the Buddha looks no different from any other person. Following the example of the Greek and Roman gods depicted as human beings, the Buddha also appeared now in human form. This statue of the Buddha as an ascetic is carved in stone. The Buddha sought spiritual enlightenment through fasting, and this representation of him, gaunt and wasted, is truly impressive. Of all the statues depicting the Buddha in human form, this is probably one of the best. The solid image of the Buddha started to travel eastwards from Gandhara, along the Silk Road, through China and the Korean Peninsula, until it finally arrived in Japan. Statues of the Buddha spread far and wide. Sometimes smiling, sometimes stern, these statues took on the characteristics of the different countries and people along the way. Japan entered the Heian period in the 9th century, and at this time, the newest form of Buddhism was brought over from China. This was esoteric Buddhism. And from around this time, adherents started to build temples deep in the mountains, away from the everyday world. What better place? After all, the mountains were originally the domain of the gods. The Buddha of Healing at Jingoji Temple in Kyoto. We can sense the solid flesh of his body and his piercing eyes. Esoteric Buddhism added a new dimension to the statue of the Buddha. This statue of the Buddha has been made by the unique Japanese method of carving it out of one piece of wood and leaving it unpainted. From around about this time, there was a big increase in the number of statues of the Buddha being carved out of wood. This may very well have been because Buddhists were making a conscious effort to enlist the support of the gods who dwelt in the trees. The Amitabha in the Phoenix Hall of Byodo-in Temple in Uji, near Kyoto. This was the work of the famous 11th century Buddhist sculptor, Jocho. Note the smooth, flowing lines of the body and the gentle, compassionate eyes. Around about this time, the Japanese statues of the Buddha turned away from the Chinese influence and took on an image of peaceful harmony that became typical of this country. This statue of Amitabha, the Buddha of Western Pure World, represents the Japanese version at its best. At the same time, another Japanese form was taking shape elsewhere. During the middle of the Heian period, around about the 11th century, in an attempt to bring Shintoism and Buddhism even closer, a new doctrine of Shinto reincarnations of Buddhist deities was popularized. It implies the native gods of Japan were originally Buddhas, and these Buddhas had reappeared as gods. And a new form appeared, based on this new way of thinking. The 11-headed Bodhisattva of Mercy, the principal image of the Hasedera Temple. 10 meters tall, it is the largest wooden statue of the Buddha. It is thought to be made from the trunk of a single cypress tree. To the left of the principal image stands Naga, one of the 8 dragon kings. Converted to Buddhism, he was appointed to protect the Bodhisattva. Now, according to the doctrine of reincarnation, Nanda Naga, as well as being the dragon king, was also a Shinto god, the Kasuga Daimyojin deity. To the right of the Bodhisattva stands the Dainichi, the highest-ranking Buddha of esoteric Buddhism. And according to the reincarnation theory, Dainichi became Amaterasu Omikami, the sun goddess, the mythological founder of Japan. How did the Japanese come to terms with this complicated relationship between Buddhism and Shintoism?
One way, of course, was compromise. They delegated different responsibilities to Shintoism and to Buddhism. For instance, the Shinto gods had direct connections with the practicalities and concrete rewards of this life. Buddhism, on the other hand, was concerned with the more universal questions of life and death and would take care of that area. And in the case of Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva took on many forms. Then, in line with the reincarnation theory, the gods were said to be the reincarnation of Buddhas. In that way, Shintoism was incorporated into the Buddhist system. It was a happy compromise between the two, Buddhism and Shintoism.
1,500 years have passed since the arrival of Buddhism in Japan. The spirit of Japan, which allowed the Buddhas to live in peaceful harmony with the Shinto gods, still lives on in many aspects of our lives. A steel plant employing the latest technology. Even here, we see how two apparently opposing cultures have come together. For instance, there's nothing unusual about having a small shrine to the gods in this computer room. In their different capacities, the Shinto gods, Buddhism, and high technology all contribute towards the success of industry. This attitude has something in common with the early days, when people recognized the coexistence of Shintoism and Buddhism. Before and after any important Buddhist memorial service, the monks at the Shuichi Temple in Nara pay homage to the gods at Hachiman Shrine within their temple precincts. This tradition has continued unchanged ever since the late 9th century, when the Hachiman Shrine was built here at the temple. Long ago, when Shintoism and Buddhism met for the first time, they decided not to fight each other. They chose instead the path of peaceful coexistence. Despite many crises along the way, they have managed to preserve this harmony to this day. Ever since the introduction of Buddhism, the Japanese through the ages have prayed to both the Shinto gods and the Buddhas.
When people are in trouble, they pray to both the gods and to the Buddhas. But when things get so bad that there seems to be no hope, they despair of the existence of either the gods or the Buddhas. I don't think it's a case of which to pray to, the gods or the Buddhas. They're so much a part of their daily lives as far as asking favors is concerned. But choosing a certain god as their object of worship doesn't mean that people are willing to sacrifice their lives for that belief. It's the same with praying to the Buddha. If things aren't going too well, they may very well abandon Buddhism and go over to one of the Shinto gods. People have no qualms about changing from one to the other. They stick with one as long as it's useful, and then change their loyalties if they see it isn't doing anything for them. I suppose from a positive point of view, you could say it's a pragmatic, flexible attitude. But it has its drawbacks as well. It's opportunist, and because it lacks principle, people adjust themselves to the situation of the moment and tend to be fickle. Yes, there's a strong tendency to take this attitude.
The last stage of the water-drawing festival at Todaiji Temple is the tapta, trial by fire. It's full of mystique and incorporates aspects of similar rites from India and Persia. Buddhism arrived in Japan from China and the Korean peninsula and introduced a completely new form to this country. Ever since, Shintoism and Buddhism have influenced each other and live on in the mind and cultural forms of the Japanese people.